Ocean of Storms by Brief and Dreamy. Chapter 5. Up in Gryffindor Tower, as Tom Riddle's body had cooled on the floor of the Great Hall, it had been just the three of them, Harry, Ron, and Hermione. They huddled together, giddy with shock and relief. For the first time in years, Harry allowed himself to look towards the future, to believe that he had a future. But come morning, it had been time to begin moving the bodies, and the elation faded away. The funeral started. The relatives of the dead all wanted to talk to Harry, to thank him and touch him. They needed more than that. His attention, his grace. As if because of what he'd done, he had some wisdom or power to lessen their grief. Harry, who was not someone for whom emotion flowed easily, especially with those he didn't know well, did his best to give them what they needed. He'd let their loved ones die. He owed it to them. He attended funeral after funeral. The parents, children, friends, and partners of the fallen rubbed their grief against him with their tear-dampened fingers, as if he were a talisman. The residue left him heavy. He repeated the same memorized words of condolence, gave them eye contact, and mirrored their pain. He carried their grief on his back. If Tonks or Lupin or Fred or any of the others floated through his mind, he pushed them away. He didn't let himself remember haunted black eyes losing their light as they gazed hungrily into his own. There wasn't time for him to feel his own grief. He needed to help everyone else with theirs, because it was his fault. But now he was on his own, and pain crashed through him with tidal ferocity. He hugged his knees and grit his teeth. He'd sealed his bed curtains shut and cast enough spells that no one could hear anything outside them. He didn't cry often or easily, but something had broken inside him, and now his emotions were gushing out like the blood from a jagged gash in his heart. He felt stupid, ridiculous, and childlike, yet he couldn't stop his eyes from stinging or his shoulders from trembling. He wanted Ginny. He wanted Molly. He didn't want to burden Ron and Hermione, to make them parent him yet again. As soon as Colin had mentioned Lupin, Harry knew they'd all be there. That's what Hermione's book said. An entire village. Everyone. And where would a crowd of ghosts who didn't want to be discovered hang out? Somewhere no one living ever went. That's why Nearly Headless Nick held his party in that room of the dungeons. Lupin and Tonks. Fred. And of course Snape, who seemed to have put himself forward as their leader. "It is possible you're minutely less dim than I'd imagined," Snape had said. "Although perhaps it was only your usual luck that brought you here." His throat too tight to speak, Harry held his hand to his chest, within which his heart pounded hard enough to leave him breathless. "Shall I give you a moment to pull yourself together?" Snape continued. "Leave him be, Sev," said a feminine voice. Tonks, her hair as silvery as the rest of her, floated to Snape's side. The poor kid must be shocked out of his mind. Snape's lip curled. "Shall we discuss once again your insistence on referring to me as Sev, Nymphadora? I'd imagine we'd seen the subject through, and yet—" "Oh, drink a calming draught, Severus." She floated closer to Harry and peered at his face, forehead lined with concern. "All right there, Harry?" Harry nodded. He swallowed and found he was finally able to speak. "Colin never told me. He never said that." "We had hoped no one would ever have to know," said Remus, who appeared at Tonk's side. "We hoped to figure out a way to rectify our dilemma before being discovered." "Only the rectifying didn't work out," said Fred's voice. Harry jerked, startled. "We're a pathetically unrectified lot, stuck like fat rats in a thin pipe." Heart swelling, Harry smiled at him. Fred grinned back. Then Harry noticed the silvery blood dripping from a gash running down the side of his head. The smile fell away. "And to think I used to be the handsome one," said Fred with a wink. "Now George has me beat, and he's only got one ear. Don't tell him I said so. It'll go straight to his head." Finding it difficult to draw in air, Harry bent over and rested his hands on his knees. "Merlin help us," said Snape. "Come now, Severus," said Remus. "It's only reasonable that Harry is taken aback." "The whole time?" said Harry. The ghost went quiet. "You've been here since the battle." He scanned the room. There were about 40 or 50 of them, he reckoned. Some faces he recognized, some he didn't. They'd all died, all been killed fighting for him. He thought back to that night, as he'd done more times than he could remember, and went over the chain of choices he'd made. He tried to rearrange it, to fix it. If he'd gone to Voldemort sooner, the moment he'd been summoned, he hadn't known what would happen, of course, and they'd had the diadem to find, but it wasn't right. They shouldn't have had to die, not when he'd survived. Most of the ghosts crowded in small groups behind Snape and the others, whispering and staring at him. In the back corner, however, was a gap, a space in which a single ghost floated back and forth, her long hair floating behind her. The other ghosts seemed to be avoiding her. "Where is he?" she wailed. "Have you seen him? I must find him. My lord needs me. I am his most loyal, his most dedicated. Where is he gone?" Remus's face darkened. "We must find a way to shut her up." "I was never able to do so while living," said Snape. "Bellatrix's enjoyment of the sound of her own voice is surpassed only by her late great lord and master." "She got stuck behind too?" asked Harry. His head had filled with the flickering static of sleeplessness. Perhaps he was dreaming. The scene was so much like one of his dreams. "My giddy aunt?" said Tonks. "No, we think she chose to say. She's different." Bellatrix lifted her arms to the ceiling and wailed. The ghosts closest to her winced and moved further away. Harry rubbed his eyes with his fists and almost lost his balance. "Merlin, you're about to drop," said Tonks. She reached for him, then withdrew her arm, looking frustrated. "Harry," said Remus, "go and get some sleep." Harry nodded, then glanced again at Snape. He stared back at Harry, somehow even more intimidating as a ghost. There was a sharpness in his eyes that his portrait lacked. This was Snape. All of him. Harry shivered. "Do as Lupin says," said Snape. "We'll no doubt still be here tomorrow." A familiar desire to defy him rose up, but fatigue won out. Harry turned and stumbled out of the room, craving his bed and oblivion. Once he'd returned to the bedroom, he'd had a few hours of agitated sleep. He waited until the others left for breakfast before getting up. He splashed his parchment-colored face with water in the bathroom, hoping to make it less puffy. The mirror started to say something, but Harry interrupted it, glaring. "I know," said Harry. "I look like a flibber-gibber's backside." The mirror sniffed, which was odd, given it had no nose. "Nana a refreshing charm wanteth fixeth." Harry'd seen Mrs. Weasley use the charm on wilting flowers. He shrugged and cast it at his face. Moisture prickled across his cheeks, and he gained a little color. "Thanks." Once in the Great Hall, he slid into a seat next to Luna, avoiding Ron and Hermione's questioning glances. He let his eyes unfocus. The murmur of conversation around him blurred into an indecipherable rumble. He reached for a piece of toast. The smell of bacon and eggs turned his stomach. "Your Auror will forgive you, Harry," said Luna. "I think he understood." Nibbling on the corner of his toast, Harry blinked at her, wrong-footed as always by her perception. No sooner had the dishes vanished than Professor McGonagall appeared, looming behind them. "The three of you," she said, looking at him, then Ron, and Hermione in turn. "My office now, if you please. You two, not." Surprised, Harry turned. Malfoy looked equally bemused. He whispered something to Nott. Nott scowled and shook his head, then got up from the table. Ron and Hermione fell into step at Harry's side, but he hunched his shoulders and kept his head down, hoping they wouldn't try and make him talk. He couldn't think of how to tell him about the ghosts. It was too big. He imagined the words leaving his mouth, and his eyes started to sting again. He'd do it later, once he'd slept and had the energy to stay calm. "It won't be that bad," said Ron. "Come on, mate, you look like you're—" "I'm fine." He winced. He hadn't meant to sound so sharp. It worked, though. Ron and Hermione shared one of their secret looks, but didn't say anything else until they were in McGonagall's office. Meyer, Ron's Auror Jimenez, and 2 other Aurors were there, waiting for them. Harry kept his eyes down and sat down in one of the wooden chairs facing McGonagall's desk. Meyer came to stand behind him. Harry glanced up at him. Meyer gave him a small smile. He squeezed Harry's shoulder, and Harry went liquid with relief. He straightened his back and whispered to Ron, "Sorry, I didn't get much sleep." Ron gave him an affectionate knock with his shoulder. Nott gripped the arms of his chair as if he'd otherwise float away, his jaw set, shoulders tense. The only reason Harry could see why he'd be there was to rat them further out. Harry glared, willing him to look back, but Nott kept his eyes forward. Snape's portrait pretended to doze. The large frame behind the headmistress's chair was, as usual, empty. McGonagall sat down, and when Harry saw the lines of fatigue around her eyes, he went cold with shame. "I'm sorry," he blurted out. "It was stupid. It was a stupid thing to do. I didn't think it through properly. We just wanted to. People are scared and upset, and I thought." McGonagall held up a hand, and Harry closed his mouth. "Well, I'm confident your intentions were virtuous, Harry," she said. "The fact remains that you disregarded my request and attempted to do something I specifically asked you not to do. Did it not occur to you that by leading a group made up of untrained young people, barely of age, to confront a powerful dark wizard, you were putting them in serious danger?" Harry crossed his arms. "I didn't ask them to come with us. It was meant to be just me and Ron." Despite his best efforts, his temper started to flare. "And to be fair, Professor, every one of them fought in the battle. We might not be fully trained, but we're not inexperienced." "It was me," said Hermione, wringing her hands. "I brought the others, not Harry or Ron. I didn't want them to go into the forest on their own." "They chose to follow us," said Ron. "They wanted to fight." "I understand that," McGonagall said, meeting each of their eyes one by one. "And after some consideration, I've decided that it was unfair of me to expect you to remain idle while Hogwarts is threatened." Sitting up straight, Harry said, "You mean we can—" Once again, McGonagall raised her hand, cutting him off. "Let me be clear. If you give me further cause to mistrust you, I will ask you to leave Hogwarts altogether, no matter how good your intentions." "Yes," said Harry. "Yes, of course." "And that goes for the Aurors as well. You will obey them to the letter, to the smallest detail. Is that understood?" "Completely, 100% understood," said Harry. "Very good. Those of you who are of age and who wish to do so may go out in a group accompanied by the Aurors." Harry couldn't restrain his grin. McGonagall sighed, but there was warmth and a bit of amusement in her eyes. "Thank you, Professor," said Harry. "So, what's he doing here?" asked Ron, jerking his head at Nott. "Would you like to explain, Mr. Nott?" asked McGonagall. Nott didn't look at them as he spoke. "My father," he said, voice laced with bitterness. "He knew Dolohov quite well." He swallowed. "When he'd meet with Father, I'd listen in. I know quite a bit about him. I think I can be helpful." He folded his hands in his lap, staring at his fingers. "How do we know we can trust him?" asked Ron. "He could be leading us into a trap." "Mr. Weasley," McGonagall began. "I'll swear a blood bond," said Nott, finally looking up, golden eyes flaring. "That what you want? If my word isn't good enough for you, I'll swear an unbreakable vow." Ron leant back, eyebrows raised. "No, There will be no blood bonds or unbreakable vows," said McGonagall. "I've spoken with Mr. Nott privately, and he is trustworthy. Can I assume you will take my word on this, Mr. Weasley?" Harry nodded, although he still didn't feel entirely comfortable about it. Dumbledore had been right about Snape, he reminded himself. McGonagall must know something about Nott that made her certain. Nevertheless, as they made their way back down the stairs, Harry fell into step with Nott. Nott glanced at him and sighed. "Why?" asked Harry. "Your dad's a Death Eater. Why did I turn into a worthless blood traitor and turn my back on my family and heritage as a pureblood?" His voice held that note of bitterness again, and there was a stiffness to his tone that made Harry wonder if he were repeating something that had been said to him. "Around the time my wonderful, pureblood father, upstanding member of the Sacred 28, started coming back from raids with his robes soaked in muggle blood." Ron appeared at Harry's side, Hermione next to him. "You could just be saying that." Nott continued. "He made me come with him, wanted me to join in, and when I wouldn't, he called me. He said I was—" His voice broke and he halted, face white. "If I'm no longer his son, then he's no longer my father. It's just logic." He looked at Harry. I testified against him in the trials. I told the ministry what I'd seen, what he'd told me. I helped send him to Azkaban. That's why McGonagall trusts me." He moved his gaze to Ron. "That good enough for you, Weasley?" Ron swallowed, then nodded. Yeah. They all spent a bit of time examining their shoes, except for Nott, who stood stiff and tall, his jaw clenched. Hermione broke the silence, her voice quiet. "That must have been very hard for you, Theo." "What's right instead of what's easy," said Nott. "Isn't that what Dumbledore said?" Nott met Harry's eyes, then looked away again. His frizzy hair fell over his eyes, and he shook it away, as if he needed a haircut but hadn't realized. Harry remembered hearing that his mother had died when he was a child, and now his dad was gone too. Something tightened inside of him. "Thank you," he said, "for offering to help." "Yeah," said Ron. I reckon you're a good bloke." "Awfully good of you to say so, Weasley," Nott replied, a note of sarcasm in his voice. "You can't blame us for being careful," said Ron. "I know." Nott's shoulders slumped. "Believe me, I know." They descended the stairs. Their footsteps echoed, and Harry marveled at how different the school sounded with so few people inside it. He yawned and rubbed his eyes. "Did you get any sleep at all last night?" asked Hermione. "A bit." He was going to have to tell them, Ron and Hermione, about Remus and Tonks and the others. He'd have to tell Ron about Fred. And Ginny. His throat started to tighten again, imagining what his friend's response would be. Not yet. He couldn't do it yet. He needed to sit with the knowledge first, to wait until it stopped shuddering against the inside of his skull. He couldn't think of how to say it, what words to use. He yawned again, bigger this time. "I reckon I'll go and have a nap." Lunch had passed by the time he awoke, fresh and clear-headed again. They weren't due to go out with the oars until evening, so Harry had several hours to fill. The ghosts continued insisting their way back into his consciousness, seeping through the smoke beneath the door. He'd picture their faces, and his chest would tighten, his breathing quicken. A distraction. He needed a good, powerful distraction. He put his mind through the process of considering helping Seamus with brickwork, or Hermione with the library. Because. Then he went to find Malfoy. He'd already been heading up the stairs towards the bathroom while he was doing the considering, but that didn't mean the considering didn't count. He was completely in control of himself and his choices. By the time he reached the stairway leading to the 6th floor, his heart was racing, and not from the climb. It happened so quickly the first time, he hadn't had time to think, to anticipate, to worry. Gripping the handrail, he closed his eyes. Malfoy, tall and pointy, his sneer, his white blonde hair, long, pale fingers, and a face that revealed more than he seemed to want it to. That mouth that could set Harry ablaze with a single word. Just thinking about him made flames flicker and rise, nerves mixed with hunger and resentment. It was easy to imagine doing things to Malfoy, bending him into shapes, digging in his fingers and teeth, but picturing wasn't the same as doing. And Harry, he wanted, more even than he wanted to avoid embarrassing himself, he wanted to impress Malfoy. Impress wasn't the right word. He wanted to defeat him, to win. Antsy, and on the verge of irritable, he started to climb the final flight of stairs, but halted when Malfoy appeared at the top, as if Harry's thoughts had summoned him. When he spotted Harry, he froze. They stared at each other, a question passing between them. Malfoy shifted into a casual lean against the railing. "Come to practice your charm work, Potter." Merlin, that was all it took, that sarcastic, insinuating drawl. Deciding that he didn't have the patience for games, Harry said, "No, I've come for you." Malfoy's lashes fluttered, and he responded in a higher pitch than normal. "Have you, then?" "Do you need me to repeat it?" It felt more like provoking an argument than anything else. But that made it easier. Harry knew how to fight. He knew how to fight with Malfoy, and he knew that he could win. Wrinkling his nose, Malfoy said, "No, Potter, I got it the first time. You aren't that oblique." "Well," said Harry, "you haven't bottled it, have you?" For a few further seconds, Malfoy clung to the banister. His expression remained haughty, but the whiteness of his knuckles let Harry know that he was nervous too, and that was an enormous relief. Harry thought of the look Ron sometimes gave Hermione before the two of them would disappear somewhere alone together. It was sort of a speaking look, an intensity of the eyes, and it made Hermione smile and turn pink. Harry gave it a go. Malfoy's lips parted. "No," he squeaked, then louder and faster. "No, I haven't bottled it. As if I'd be afraid of you, Mr. Expelliarmus. More like a ragged alley cat than a lion." He moved down the staircase towards Harry. "You've certainly got the scars for it. Only a street cat has better hair." He kept talking as he descended, like he couldn't help it. "How old is that shirt you're wearing? It looks like something a house elf would use to polish furniture." "Merlin, would you shut up?" Harry ran his fingers through his hair. Why? Why? There were dozens of people his age in the castle. Why did he have to be attracted to this mouthy git? Why couldn't one single thing in his life be nice and uncomplicated? Getting further into things would only make it worse. He should leave. Maybe shove Malfoy first or something. He should go back to the dungeon and lock himself in his room before anything else happened between them. Malfoy and he were level now, both on the landing. His fancy robes hung unfastened, the top buttons of his shirt open, exposing the sharp angle of his collarbone, and Harry still didn't know if he'd scarred. He wanted to tear his shirt off and see, to shove him down right there on the stairs and tear into him. So, one more time. He'd do this one more time. He backed away into a nearby classroom, and Malfoy followed him, looking hypnotized. Harry flicked his wand at the door to lock it. The click echoed through unused desks. Cracked windows looked out over the Quidditch pitch. While the house elves had kept dust from gathering, the room felt abandoned, as if it hadn't been used in years. After another moment of uncertain staring, Malfoy said, "Looks like I'm not the one who—" Harry slammed Malfoy against the wall to shut him up. Malfoy gasped and struggled, although it involved grabbing Harry's shoulders and pulling him closer, so maybe struggle wasn't the right word. Each shift and squirm of Malfoy's chest and limbs against Harry's own wound him up further. He grabbed the back of Malfoy's neck to hold him still. Mere inches of air separated their faces. Malfoy's pink lips. Harry leant in, but then stopped, a quiver of discomfort preventing him from going through with the kiss. This was Malfoy. He couldn't kiss Malfoy. Malfoy lifted his gaze from Harry's mouth and frowned. He blinked, then said, "This isn't a romance, Potter." Harry snorted. Instead of kissing Malfoy, he buried his face against his neck and ran his hands down his back. Malfoy grabbed Harry's shoulders and pressed a thigh against his hips. Without kissing, it was hard to figure out where to start. Harry's head spun as he tried to decide what he wanted. Malfoy fantasies were so different than any fantasies he'd had about girls. Malfoy pressed down on his shoulders. Harry resisted until Malfoy became aggressive about it, pushing hard, trying to get Harry to go down on his knees. "I know what you're trying to make me do," said Harry. "Good," said Malfoy. "Do it then." He continued trying to force Harry to the floor. Struggling to stay upright, Harry considered. He didn't hate the idea. In fact, thinking about doing it, what it would feel like to have Malfoy in his mouth, how Malfoy might respond, made his knees wobbly. Kneeling at Malfoy's feet, looking up at him, Harry rested his hand against the wall to steady himself. It was so strange, this contradiction. It turned him on so much when Malfoy did things that made him feel a bit bad and humiliated. And he hated that. It made him ashamed. But it still turned him on enough that he didn't resist. "Potter," said Malfoy, whining. "No," said Harry. He just couldn't. Malfoy would like it too much. Malfoy's fingers tightened against his shoulders, but he stopped trying to push Harry down. Instead, he gave Harry a calculating look. Harry sighed, knowing that whatever Malfoy said was probably going to change his mind. He hated how well Malfoy could read him, especially as the workings of Malfoy's brain remained such a puzzle. He might as well just do it and save them both the trouble. It would... "I'll go first," said Malfoy. Harry widened his eyes. "Really?" "Yes, I'll do it for you, then you'll do it for me." Harry almost laughed. Because, yeah, that was the way to go about it, appealing to Harry's sense of fair play. And why did that turn him on, too? Being manipulated shouldn't be arousing, but when Malfoy did, it was. Harry couldn't help it. "Go on, then," he said. "Make me." Malfoy looked at Harry, challenging and impish. Something growled inside Harry, and he reached for him, then stopped. "No," he said. "I'm not going to make you. What do you think I am?" Huffing in frustration, Malfoy said, "I don't mean really make me. I mean, Salazar, it's like talking to a—" "Maybe don't insult me just now," said Harry. Malfoy was going to ruin it. He was going to shoot his mouth off and get Harry so angry he'd have no choice but to storm away. And Harry didn't want to storm away. He wanted Malfoy to do what he'd promised to do. "Maybe things will go better if you don't." "I'll say what I like. If you want me to stop insulting you, then stop being such an ignorant—" Without thinking, Harry slapped his hand over Malfoy's mouth. Malfoy's eyes flashed with outrage. He yanked Harry's hand away, then shoved at him. "I'll thank you not to—" Harry tried to cover his mouth again because it had been pretty satisfying the first time, but Malfoy grabbed his wrist, and then they were wrestling, grabbing at each other, each trying to gain the upper hand. The thrill of it lent Harry strength. It only took a few moments to get Malfoy on the floor, and then another to pin him down. Malfoy struggled beneath him, flushed and resentful, but Harry could feel, hard against his thigh, that he wasn't as reluctant as he looked. He squeezed Malfoy's wrists and pressed down against him. Malfoy gasped and arched, which felt so good Harry drew away again to be safe. They both took a moment to catch their breath. "You gonna do what you said?" Harry asked, shocked at how rough and low his voice sounded. "Not if you don't let go of my arms and get off of me," said Malfoy. Harry waited a few more seconds, then let him go. He sat up and waited while Malfoy rotated his wrists and stared at the bulging groin area of Harry's jeans. He was really going to do it, Harry realized. His skin went hot all over. Malfoy looked so hungry. He shuffled over on his knees until he was between Harry's spread legs. "Lie down," he said, shoving Harry's chest. Harry obeyed, his heart fluttering like a snitch. With shaking fingers, Malfoy started unbuttoning Harry's jeans. Each brush of his knuckles against Harry's cock felt like heaven, and he didn't know how he was going to survive when Malfoy actually had his mouth on him. Malfoy's eyes gleamed bright and feverish. He pulled down Harry's jeans and pants, exposing him. Harry breathed through another rush of arousal based on embarrassment. His cock quivered over his stomach, fat and red, and Malfoy knew that it was because of him, that he'd made Harry feel like that. A whimper escaped from the back of Harry's throat. Malfoy gave him a triumphant smile, then licked his lips. "Please don't let me come right away," thought Harry. He felt on the verge, and Malfoy had barely touched him. Then Malfoy went down and took him in his mouth. Pleasure, shocking in its intensity, made Harry cry out. He bit down on his lip, breathing hard, struggling to maintain control. That was Merlin. The wet heat, the soft slide of Malfoy's lips and tongue, the throb of delight when Malfoy sucked, and the sight of his blonde head bobbing, cheeks hollowed and eyes squeezed shut. That was Malfoy doing that. Draco Bloody Malfoy. On reflex, Harry thrust upwards. Malfoy gagged and gave him a warning look. Harry shook his head, unable to speak. Malfoy started sucking again. Harry clawed at the floor. He clenched his jaw, quivering, and put all his energy into trying to keep still, which was good, as it distracted him enough to stay away from the edge, and he didn't want it to end. He didn't want it to ever end. Never. Malfoy could keep sucking his cock until the end of time, and that would be perfect. But then Malfoy started doing something with his tongue that made Harry lose his mind. He yelled, helpless. For 5 more seconds he held on, as if for his life, but it felt too good. His cock throbbed and pulsed. Malfoy pulled off, fisting Harry frantically, and Harry came, whining through his teeth. The wet heat of it pattered against his t-shirt. Oh! He sucked in air, realizing that he'd been holding his breath during the last of it. Wow! His heart galloped. He shivered with pleasure and warmth like swelling sunshine. Merlin, he'd never done anything to himself that had even come close. Malfoy looked far too pleased with himself. "No dozing, Potter. You've got work to do." It might have been nice to drift off, but Harry'd already had that nap, and his mind felt bright and active. He stretched his arms above his head, yawned, then pulled up his pants and trousers. As he pushed himself up, the wet bits of his t-shirt clung to his skin. He found his wand and vanished the mess. Malfoy got to his feet and let his robes fall off his shoulders and onto the floor. So dramatic. Harry started to get up as well. "Stay there," said Malfoy. His mouth twitched, as if he were trying not to smile. But then he did smile, bright and mean. "On your knees." Harry blinked at him. "You can't back out now," said Malfoy. "We had an agreement." "Not going to back out," said Harry. Malfoy stared down at him, face flushed, his eyes alight. "You're really getting off on this, aren't you?" "You have no idea," said Malfoy. "I've got some idea." He considered teasing Malfoy, telling him he'd changed his mind and didn't want to do it, just to piss him off. But the thing was, Harry did want to do it. He really, really wanted to. Malfoy's erection tinted the front of his black linen trousers. Harry wondered what it would look like unclothed. Merlin, he was already getting randy again. Malfoy started undoing his trousers, which was fascinating. His long fingers worked the buttons, revealing what was beneath little by little. Cotton pants with a wet spot discoloring the cream fabric where Malfoy's cock jutted against them. Malfoy shoved down his trousers, then his pants. Harry stared. Draco Malfoy's cock, right in front of him. It wasn't any bigger than his, he was relieved to find, but pale in comparison, and a bit curved. Harry was going to suck on that. He didn't let the frisson of anxiety show as his mouth filled with saliva, dark blonde curly hair at the base and around Malfoy's balls. Merlin, Malfoy's balls, his cock. Harry was close enough to catch its musky, private scent. He reached out and slid a finger down the silky skin. Malfoy exhaled sharply. "Are you waiting for it to tell you what to do?" Harry raised his eyebrows at him. Malfoy continued, using a high-pitched voice. "Put me in your mouth, Potter!" He waggled himself back and forth. "Ever hear of killing the mood?" asked Harry. "And why does your penis sound like a house elf? What happens if you give it clothes?" "Shut up." Malfoy slid trembling fingers into Harry's hair, which felt weird, almost affectionate. Harry was about to shake them out, but then Malfoy tightened his fingers into fists. Everything went hazy, the sting of his hair being pulled, the feel of hard knuckles against his scalp, Malfoy's avid, hungry face. Harry took hold of Malfoy's hips to regain his balance. He took a deep breath. Then he leant in. The head slid slick against his lips. He parted them and he extended his tongue. Malfoy tasted of sex and salt. Watching for Malfoy's expression, Harry closed his lips and sucked. Malfoy gasped, shuddered, and curved forwards. Harry wrapped his fingers around the shaft to give himself more control. He tried sliding up and down, as Malfoy had done. Malfoy whimpered something that didn't sound quite like words. Grinning, Harry sucked again. "Cover your teeth," said Malfoy in a strained but clearer voice. Harry did so, resisting the temptation to bite. He couldn't get all of Malfoy's cock in his mouth, but it didn't seem to matter. He found a rhythm and fell into it. Malfoy's hand stayed tight in his hair. "Fuck, Potter. Fuck, that's good. That's so good. Keep it up." Harry paused to swallow, and Malfoy's words tumbled over each other. "If you stop, I will murder you. I swear on my mother, I'll kill you." Harry snickered and kept going. "Good. That's good." Malfoy's voice drove him crazy. And the smell of him, and the way he'd started trembling. Harry remembered that Malfoy had moved his hand along with his mouth, and he tried that out. Malfoy moaned, so Harry did it faster. He tried out the tongue thing, and Malfoy went mad. "Yes. Oh, do that. Keep doing that, Potter. Like that. Just like that. Oh, I'm going to, Harry pulled off, not sure he wanted a mouthful of Malfoy's cum. The grip on his hair sharpened painfully. Malfoy gasped. Harry realized he might have made a mistake and squeezed his eyes shut tight. Hot liquid splattered against his face. Then again, Malfoy whimpered. Some of it dripped over Harry's lips, some down on the lenses of his glasses. Malfoy, still panting, gazed down at him with an almost religious sense of wonder. Scowling, Harry tried to pull away and get his wand to clean himself off, but Malfoy's hands tightened in his hair, holding him in place. Breathless, he said, "I'm going to remember this moment for the rest of my life." He broke into a rapturous smile, his eyes sliding over Harry's face. Malfoy's pleasure at seeing Harry covered with his mess pissed Harry off as much as it turned him on. He jerked away and wiped his face off on the front of his t-shirt. "You could have done that with a wand, you know," said Malfoy, doing himself up, lazy and satisfied. Harry hated him. He wondered how long it would be until they could do it again. "Well, you were wrong," said Hermione. Harry stopped short in the doorway to the Slytherin common room and considered going somewhere else instead. Hermione, bundled up in a coat, hat, scarf, and mittens, faced Ron, who wore a mulish expression. "I showed up because I didn't want you running off into the forest on your own, not because I decided it was a good idea," Hermione continued. "My position hasn't changed, Ron. You should be leaving this up to the professional Aurors." "Professor McGonagall is behind us," Ron responded. "Why can't you be too? Do you think you know better than she does?" Narrowing her eyes, Hermione said, "You know full well that's only because she knows you'll go out anyway." "She realized we should be allowed to fight to protect Hogwarts," said Ron. "That's what she said." He turned to Harry. "Tell her." Desperately clinging to the sense of relaxation and well-being he'd carried down from the empty classroom, Harry held up his hands. "You both know where I stand." He kept his distance. He could still smell Malfoy on his skin, and he didn't want to risk them picking up on it. "Did you not hear anything I said last night?" said Hermione, getting a bit shrill. Harry wanted to get away, but he saw genuine fear in her eyes and stopped himself. "We'll have the Aurors with us this time," he said. "Meyer is good, really good. He won't let anything happen to us. And I promise we'll let them take the lead, okay? We'll be fine." She bit her lip. "Nothing I say will make any difference, will it?" Ron stood with his palms pressed against his eyes. He lowered his hands, then approached her. He slid his arms around her shoulders. She stiffened, but let him. "Hermione, if you really... I don't want to make you cry." Harry walked to the bookcase on the other side of the room. The books all looked ancient and seemed to be about history and genealogy. He pulled one out at random to distract himself from his friend's argument. Notable magical names of our time. Sighing, he thumbed through the thick pages until he got to the P's. Pattinson, Faffle, Podmore, Potter. The wizarding family of Potters descends from the 12th century wizard Linfred of Stinchcombe, a locally well-beloved and eccentric man whose nickname, the Potterer, became corrupted in time to Potter. Harry wasn't sure what to do with that information. He glanced at his friends to see if they'd finished yet. They held each other, Hermione's head resting against Ron's chest. Moving towards the bedroom with great relief, Harry called to Ron, "I'm just going to get changed." Once he was alone, he peeled off his t-shirt. He looked around, just to be sure he was unobserved, then sniffed it. The scene flooded back. Malfoy's voice, his taste, the things he'd said. It really had happened. With Malfoy. He shook his head, then tossed the t-shirt in the laundry bin for the elves. He took a moment to feel sympathy for them, having to clean up after so many teenage boys on a daily basis. He stretched towards the ceiling, his muscles still humming with pleasure. It had been ages since he'd felt this free and relaxed. A spike of cold pressed against his breastbone. "How do you get that scar?" asked Colin, pointing at the pink marbled oval left by the locket. Drawing his arms across his chest, Harry took a step back. "It's a long story." "You've got a lot of scars, haven't you?" Colin circled around him, inspecting his bare skin. Harry yanked open his trunk, pulled out a clean shirt, and slid it on. He sat down on his bed, and Colin settled next to him. So much for free and relaxed. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you about the others," said Colin, head down. "He just told me—" "I know," said Harry. "Snape didn't want you to tell anyone. It's okay, Colin. You didn't do anything wrong." "Bet it was a shock, seeing everyone there." "You could say that." Colin fiddled with a tear in his ghostly robes. I'm glad you know now. What did Ron and Hermione say when you told them? Harry cleared his throat. I haven't told them yet. Okay, said Colin. It's just that Snape says that the longer we're stuck here, the harder it'll be for us to move on. So maybe you could tell them, Hermione at least, so she can help you figure out what to do. Harry nodded. You want to move on? I'm a little scared of what comes next, but I don't want to stay like this forever. I just don't know how to tell Ron, said Harry. About Fred, I mean. Harry thought back to Ron in the days after the war. He'd cycled between exaggerated jubilation, fury, and abject grief. Thank God for Hermione. It had been agony to watch, and Harry hadn't had any idea how to help him. He's just kind of getting back to normal. If he sees Fred, I'm scared it'll start all over again. Colin nodded. That's what Professor Lupin said, that I need to let Dennis, that it will be harder for him if he sees me again. He's doing better, said Harry. I saw him with Susan Bones by the lake the other day. I think maybe they're dating. Susan Bones? Colin grinned. An older woman. Hey, Dennis. I'll tell them soon, said Harry. I promise. And then we'll get to work on setting you free. Meeting up with the Aurors was initially a bit disappointing, as they weren't going to actually do any hunting. Instead, Jimenez went through a series of defensive spells. However, Harry's irritation at not immediately getting out there melted away as he practiced the new magic. Not all defensive magic is about attacking, said Meyer. Often, simply bewildering your target will give you enough time to disarm and contain him. Harry swiveled his wand in the circular pattern Jimenez had demonstrated, then flicked it upwards toward Ron. Replica Elusio! A new Ron appeared at Ron's side. Harry pointed his wand to the right and flicked again. Another Ron appeared. Harry moved and flicked, again and again, until the hill was scattered with Rons, all grinning at him. It's like that night, said Ron. Replicas of Ron's voice echoed over the hill, merging into a chorus. When we all polyjuiced into you, 7 Harrys. It's more like 20 of you, said Harry, not wanting to think about that day. Hermione was right, said Ron. All the Rons looked around at the other Rons and their bright orange Cannons t-shirts. This t-shirt washes me out a bit, he shrugged. I'm willing to make that sacrifice for my team. Kind of a necessary part of being a Cannons fan, isn't it? Said Nott. Martyrdom? 20 Rons glared at him. And who do you support? The Bats, of course, said Nott, lifting his chin. My cousin plays for them. Easy supporting a team when they win, Ron muttered. Doesn't require any real loyalty. Right, said Jimenez, clapping her hands. Let's move on. After a couple hours of practice, they made their way back to the castle. Meyer fell into step next to Harry. You are happy with our new plan? Yeah, said Harry. It's brilliant. I'm glad that you are pleased with it. Meyer smiled, warm blue eyes crinkling at the corners. Thank you for not hating me, for giving me another chance, said Harry. Everyone deserves a second chance, said Meyer. He ruffled Harry's hair. Even headstrong boys who don't like to do what they're told. Even though being called a boy gave Harry a ping of disappointment, he laughed while ducking away. Meyer made him feel so strange. He put a glow inside him, a desire to be seen. What confused Harry was its familiarity. When had he felt this way before? And why did it make him ache? The day's various activities had left Harry a bit worn out, despite his nap. There was an hour until dinner. He welcomed the darkness of the Slytherin common room. Wanting some quiet time to himself, he picked one of the leather armchairs and turned it so it faced the corner. Using the light of his wand, he thumbed through Bill's book until he found where he'd left off. Astoria's cat padded over and looked up at him, mewing. He patted his knee. She jumped up and settled, purring, in his lap. Her warmth spread through his jeans. Instead of reading, he ran his fingers through the fur on the back of her neck. It's ultimately pointless. Malfoy sounded disdainful as he entered the room. They'll come over, maybe even have a good time, but they'll never truly like us. We'll never be friends with them. Astoria was there too. Do you mean the Gryffindors, or one particular Gryffindor? A pause. Don't look like that, darling. It's nothing to be ashamed of. Malfoy spoke in a vicious whisper. You're talking utter nonsense. Not that that's anything new. I simply remember how you were with Adrian. Adrian, that oaf. I haven't thought of him in years. Yes, said Astoria, her voice gentle. Only at the time... Oh, never mind Adrian. He doesn't matter. But have you considered, Draco, that if you wish for someone to like you, you'll have more luck if you behave likably? What an angel you are. Harry whispered, Nox, and shrunk down into the chair. One particular Gryffindor. Did she mean him? She couldn't mean him, Harry snorted to himself. Malfoy didn't give a fuck whether or not Harry liked him. But then who? Merlin, Malfoy's voice. If Harry responded like this every time Malfoy spoke, it was going to be a problem. You're still planning on going ahead with it? Asked Theo. Harry twitched. If they all flooded into the room, he'd have to keep hiding until they left again. It would be better to reveal himself now than wait until it looked like he'd spent ages eavesdropping on their conversation. He coughed, then lowered the cat to the floor and stood up. Oh, for fuck's sake, said Malfoy, looking more startled than Harry reckoned was warranted. We didn't know you were here, Harry, said Astoria, looking at Malfoy. Sorry, said Harry. Yeah. So I thought I should... The dim lighting made Malfoy's pale skin look almost white. Trying to eavesdrop, Potter? Make sure the Slytherins aren't up to anything wicked? Are you? Harry smiled to make it clear he was joking, but Malfoy glared anyway. Theo had his hand over his mouth. Harry thought he might be laughing, but wasn't sure. There was something going on. Bloody Slytherins and their secrets. Harry wanted to ask which Gryffindor Astoria had been talking about, but Malfoy was clearly agitated, and Harry figured it would be best to leave it alone. Malfoy wouldn't look at him. Harry shoved his hands into his pockets. How long ago had it been? Malfoy had changed his robes, and it looked like he'd showered and done whatever it was he did to make his hair so sleek and shiny. Harry rocked on his feet. He wanted to rub his face against that bit of exposed neck beneath Malfoy's jaw. Malfoy finally slid his eyes in Harry's direction. Harry bit his lip to keep from smiling, but he let it show in his eyes. Malfoy didn't smile back, but his shoulders relaxed. Harry couldn't be the specific Gryffindor Malfoy wanted to like him. He knew that. He was pretty sure he knew that. A week passed, and Harry still hadn't figured out how he was going to tell Ron about Fred's ghost. Every day he procrastinated made him feel guiltier, and Hermione hadn't said anything about a solution to the ghost predicament yet. Andromeda had sent him an owl telling him how Teddy was getting on. It contained a photo. Teddy waved the toy snitch Harry had given him, gurgling happily, then shoved it in his mouth. Harry ignored his breakfast, staring at the photo, until Ron reached across the table and snatched it away to look at it with Hermione. They'd have to go and visit again soon. He thought about Remus and Tonks, and didn't touch his toast and eggs. A great rustling filled the air as a flock of paper cranes flew into the great hall. Oh, it worked! Astoria clapped her hands. Everyone looked up as the cranes circled above the tables, round and round. They separated and landed in front of each student in turn, slowly opening and closing their wings. "What's on?" asked Seamus. He reached for his crane and peered at it suspiciously. "Be careful," said Hannah. "They could be cursed." "They're not cursed," said Malfoy. "You're meant to open them and read them. Clearly, we should have sent separate owls with instructions first, but I forgot how dimwit—" "Keep quiet for once," said Nott. "You'll ruin it." As everyone started unfolding their cranes, the great hall exploded into cacophony as they all started singing at slightly different times. They had high, tinny voices. Harry wanted to cover his ears, but his crane kept trying to peck his face. It had a sharp beak for a piece of parchment. "Why is mine the only one trying to bite?" "I made yours especially for you," said Malfoy. Harry showed him 2 fingers, then managed to open the last fold of parchment. "Slytherin house is very old. Cozy for us, but for some it's cold. Come and join us for a midnight soiree. Hot buttered rum and games to play. Blankets and jumpers to warm you right up. Don't be afraid. Take a chance, Buttercup. We might be snakes, but I swear we won't bite. Join us on Tuesday in the middle of the night. A party, said Luna. How lovely. Your poetry sucks, Malfoy, said Ron. Malfoy started whistling Weasley is our king. This is what they'd been talking about the other week, Harry realized. He glanced at Malfoy, who quickly looked away. The mood of the room lifted, with everyone talking. Astoria beamed, looking happier than Harry had ever seen. They seem to like the idea, said Daphne. That's sweet, I suppose. I'll show you, sweet, said Seamus, making an obscene gesture. I'm certain you'd like to, said Daphne. The Ravenclaws whispered, their heads bent together. Eventually, Anthony Goldstein raised his arm. We'll bring spirits. They've set up a distillery in one of the spare rooms, said Hannah. She lifted her head. I'll bring cakes. I'll bring records, said Ernie Macmillan. You will not, said Justin. I'm not spending all night listening to a cauldron full of boiling love. It's hot, strong love, said Ernie indignantly. And Celestina is a musical genius, I'll have you know. Oh, this is wonderful, said Astoria. Everyone's joining in. It's just what I hoped for. It'll be an opportunity to get sozzled, if nothing else, said Malfoy. Sozzled? Said Harry. Potter, said Theo. Harry had never seen him with this expression before. His face lit up with amusement. Potter, you have to see Draco drunk. You have to. It's an experience all its own. Harry had seen that expression on Malfoy's face before. Red spots on his cheeks and murder in his eyes. Something to look forward to, Harry said, grinning. Fuck you both, said Malfoy. You wish, said Harry on reflex. The rest of Malfoy's face went red, and Harry felt his own do the same. Harry cursed himself, but it didn't seem as if anyone but the two of them had noticed what he'd said. And Theo, of course, who looked like he might fall off the bench, he was laughing so hard. Harry finished his rounds with Meyer early and returned to the castle. As he headed towards the library to find Hermione, he thought about Knott's behavior at lunchtime. He and Malfoy had messed around twice more since the empty classroom. Hand jobs in the broom cupboard, and a quick and frantic bout of frauding in the common room when they'd run into each other in the middle of the night. Not new, Harry realized. Malfoy had told him. Of course he had. Malfoy had probably bragged about it. He bragged about everything. Why not this too? Harry paused and rested his hand against the wall for support. Maybe he told all the Slytherins. Before the war, Malfoy had held court at the Slytherin table, never missing an opportunity to spin a story about Harry's humiliation. If Ron found out... Harry squeezed his eyes shut. If Ron knew, Harry would have already heard about it. He decided to have a word with Malfoy, to make him understand that anything they did was private, between the two of them. Once in the library, he had to search behind several different towering piles of books. He discovered Hermione bent over the huge book she'd shown him and Ron the previous week. She'd tied her hair back in a ponytail, but several curly locks had fallen loose over her forehead. The text of the book looped and swirled, all in Latin. Hermione followed it by making a dot of white light dance across the page. She frowned as she read, looking paler than usual. A wave of fondness held Harry in place. It was easier sometimes to remember that she and Ron were still his when he was with them individually. As happy as he was that they'd finally settled into a romance, he often felt like a third wheel, which was childish, he knew, but he couldn't help it. They were the closest thing he had to family, and he didn't know who he was without them. And while he knew intellectually that they weren't abandoning him when they went off together, sometimes he got a bit panicky. So it was nice now and then to have them each on their own, all to himself. He cleared his throat. Hermione looked up. Her lips parted and her eyes grew shiny. For a second, Harry thought she was about to cry. "What?" he asked, wondering where Ron was and if he could help. "What's wrong?" "Oh," she said, closing the book with an abruptness Harry found surprising given the care she'd taken with it last time. "Harry, I didn't see you." She rubbed her eyes. "Nothing's wrong. I'm just a bit tired." She smiled. Did you find something in the book? Is that why you're upset? No. Well, maybe. I've got one idea. I've just been reading too long, I expect. It's making my eyes ache. Whatever was bothering her wasn't something she wanted to talk about, so with some relief, he let it go. Stalling, he gestured towards a book sitting on the corner of the table. It had a colorful illustration of a dragon on the cover. What kind of book is that? It's a book of spells about the breeding of magical creatures, she said. Look. She picked it up and turned to the front page. The fourth name on the checkout sheet read Hagrid in rough scrawl. 1943. He'd have only been 13. Can you picture Hagrid at 13? I saw him at 13 in one of Riddle's diary memories. Oh, that's right. She got a wistful look. Was he sweet? He was huge, and he had a giant spider in a box. Harry looked at the faded ink of the messy signature. When do you suppose he'll be back for good? When I had tea with him in his hut last month, he said that Grop was healing quickly. She set her wand on the table and turned to him. Did you have something you wanted to ask me, Harry? Is it about the ghosts? I've made some progress in my reading, and I found something that might help. We need to create a door, a path for them to follow. Like the veil? Said Harry. A cold feeling spread through his stomach. Yes, said Hermione, exactly like that. Only it's complicated. Okay? And yeah, about the ghosts. He shifted on his feet. The words still wouldn't come. He was going to have to show her. Harry had imagined Hermione would break down, but she didn't. Her face went white with shock when she first saw them, but she quickly pulled herself together. He let her speak with them on her own. There were a number of ghosts he didn't recognize, but also a good number of young students. The process started in his mind. If he'd figured out where to look for the diadem earlier, if he'd gone to Voldemort sooner, if he'd found a way into the castle that didn't alert everyone to his presence. He slunk back against the wall. It was even colder here than the Slytherin common room. He lingered morbidly on Bellatrix, who swept back and forth in her isolated corner, muttering to herself. Another ghost sat alone. Harry squinted through the gloom at the hulking male figure. With a jolt, he realized it was Vincent Crabbe. Crabbe raised his head and spotted Harry. He scowled. Torn between dislike and pity, Harry kept his face expressionless. It hadn't occurred to him that Crabbe might be here with the others, but he supposed it made sense, given he died during the battle. Goyle, having been 17 the previous year, was in prison for multiple uses of the Cruciatus curse. His mother had wept through his trial. Harry didn't believe it was right to send a boy barely out of childhood to a place as bleak as Azkaban, but there'd been nothing he could say in his defense. Snape and Hermione seemed to be having a whispered argument with some of the other ghosts. He made out Hermione saying, "We should at least try it." Tonks looked miserable, her head hanging low. Remus slid his arm around her shoulders. Fred was looking at Harry, not smiling. When Harry met his eyes, however, he grinned and waved. Disquieted, Harry waved back. By the time she rejoined Harry, Hermione's face shone white in the gloom. Harry followed her out of the chamber. "What?" he asked. "I've got to do more research," she said, not looking at him. "What did Snape say? Was he being a get?" "He agrees with me. I need to do more research." "It looks like you were arguing." "He doesn't have a particularly warm manner of speaking." Harry snorted a laugh. "You can say that again." Hermione stopped short and seemed to shudder. "What?" Harry asked again. She didn't answer, but took his hand and held it tight. Harry raised his voice. "What's going on? You should tell me if—" "I was just thinking how lucky we are not to be in there with them," she said. "That's all." Harry wasn't sure he believed her, but she wasn't going to say anything further about it. She kept hold of his hand and didn't let it go until they reached the Slytherin common room. "I'll tell Ron," she said, hugging herself. An initial swell of relief curdled into self-loathing, so Harry said, "We'll do it together." Her eyes shining, Hermione smiled at him and brushed a lock of hair off his forehead. "Like always." Harry nodded. "I'll go get Jenny. Wait here and we'll all go find her at Hufflepuff. The atmosphere might make it a bit easier for everyone." She disappeared into the Gryffindor boys' room. As he waited, Harry leaned against the wall and looked for the cat, but she wasn't around. A school of tiny glowing fish passed through the circular windows, one by one. The fire crackled across the room. Now that he was used to the constant cold, there were some nice things about staying in Slytherin. The sound of Malfoy's laugh echoed out of the corridor, sending an automatic jolt of arousal down Harry's spine, which was irritating. Then Malfoy sauntered into the room with Nott at his side. He spotted Harry, and their eyes locked, Malfoy still gleaming with amusement. Harry's pulse sped up. The automatic reaction pissed him off. He lowered his chin and glowered. Malfoy stopped what he'd been saying. His lips parted. "Salazar," said Nott, "you two are going to—" Ron and Hermione emerged, and to Harry's relief, Nott shut his mouth. Malfoy, still staring at Harry, tripped over the edge of the carpet. Nott grabbed his arm to steady him. "Watch your step, Ferret," said Ron. He looked pale enough that it was clear Hermione had already told him about Fred. "Wash your face, Weasley," said Malfoy. "It's filthy." "No, wait. That's just what your skin looks like." Nott sighed and looked at the ceiling. Harry knew, because so much staring had forced him to start understanding Malfoy's behavior, whether he liked it or not, that Malfoy had only snapped out of embarrassment. But Ron didn't. "Merlin," he said, "I thought you lot were trying to be friendlier." Malfoy raised his chin. "It's easier with some than others." He started to leave the common room. He could be so prissy, and Harry didn't know why it made him want to mess up his hair and bite his neck. Because he had years of experience watching Ron, Harry knew that he was about to lose his temper. He walked towards him. "Hey, you still reckon you're better than everyone else, don't you?" said Ron to Malfoy. "Not everyone," Malfoy drawled, "but in the case of Weasleys, it's simply undeniable." "You're not," said Ron, his voice cold and tense. Hermione took his arm, but he shrugged her off. "Supported him to the end, didn't you? Only turned when you knew he was going to lose." Malfoy's eyes flicked to Harry, then back to Ron. "Shut your mouth, Weasley. You know nothing about— Your father may have weaseled his way out of Azkaban, but he's still Death Eater scum, and you're no better." He gave Harry a nudge. "Tell him." "Look now, Weasley," said Nott. "That's crossing a line." Ron spread his arms. "It's the truth." Harry hesitated. It wasn't as if he and Malfoy had become friends. He still couldn't stand the git. He remembered Malfoy smirking down at him as he tucked himself away and tried not to squirm. Given what had changed between them, however, Harry felt awkward about ganging up on him. Even if Malfoy had brought it on himself. And Malfoy was watching Harry, his body tense, waiting to see what he would do. "He's not a Death Eater anymore," he said to Ron. Ron looked at Harry a second, his brows creased. "What?" "He's just mouthing off," Harry continued. "But he said—" "Harry's right," said Hermione. "He's just baiting you." His voice raising an octave, Ron said, "Are you defending him, Harry?" "No," said Harry, "but we need to go find Jenny." "Come on," said Hermione, rubbing his arm. Ron stared at Harry, looking like he suspected him of being someone else on Polyjuice. "Fine," he said, and stomped out of the common room. Hermione ran after him. His face expressionless, Malfoy stood silent and pale. Harry wanted to shake him. He didn't know what to do with the twisted knot of contradictions Malfoy made him feel. "You know his brother died, right?" he asked Malfoy. Malfoy nodded. "Probably best not to rile him up then." "Whatever you say, Potter." With a sigh, Harry went to catch up with his friends. The atmosphere in Hufflepuff didn't help. Ginny stared at her knees, silent tears trailing down her cheeks. Hermione sat beside her, an arm wrapped around Ginny's shoulders. "Right," said Ron. "We've told Ginny. Now you tell me where he is." His hands in fists, Ron marched across the Hufflepuff dorm and stopped halfway to the door. "Tell me now. What part of the castle?" "Ron," said Hermione, "please sit down." Harry, slumped on Parvati's neatly made bed, pressed a hand to his stomach. "You told me to wait until Ginny knew," said Ron. "She knows. I want to see him. I need to." He swallowed, then again. "Where is he, Harry?" "You can't tell anyone else," said Harry. "If it gets out, it'll be a disaster." You're giving me rules about it? He's my brother, and I thought he was dead." "Oh, Ron," said Hermione, "he's still dead. Ghosts aren't—" Ron put a shaking hand to his forehead. "Not the time for a lecture, Miney." She burst into tears. Harry envied her. His ribs ached from holding in the swell of sorrow. "Harry," said Ron, holding out his hands, begging. Harry's tongue felt thick and heavy as he spoke. "They're in the dungeon, in the room where Nearly Headless Nick held his death day party." "Right." He took a deep breath. "Come on, Jen." Ginny didn't move. "Come on, Jen," Ron repeated. He gave her a quivering smile. "It's Fred. We're going to see Fred again." "I'm not," said Ginny in a rough voice. "I'm not going to see him." "What?" Ron rubbed at his face. Everyone's gone mental." He lowered his hands. "You're not coming with me?" She shook her head. "I can't. I don't want to." "For fuck's sake, Ginny." Ginny leapt to her feet. You go see him if that's what you need. But I can't. It's not as if we have him back. He's a ghost, and he'll be gone again soon. I can't go backwards. My heart will break all over again." Ron's face contorted. "And you mustn't tell Mum," said Ginny. "You mustn't tell any of them." "George has the right to know," said Ron. "No." Ginny vehemently shook her head. Her eyes widened. "He won't be able to handle it. He's barely coping as it is. You can't tell him." Ron turned his head away. "Ron, promise me you won't tell them." "I need to think about it," he said. "I can't think right now. I need to go see Fred." "At least promise me you'll talk to me first." "Okay," said Ron. He turned and left. Hermione got up and ran after him. Ginny stood still, staring blankly, tears crusting on her face. Harry rose and went to her. He pulled her into his arms. She buried her face against his shoulder, shaking as she cried. Given that his best friend was having an emotional breakdown, a rogue Death Eater was hiding nearby, and ethereal manifestations of Harry's festering guilt were having a camp out in the dungeon, Harry wasn't sure he wanted to go to a party. It seemed frivolous. But Hermione reminded him that celebrations were even more important when times were dark. They made things lighter. They showed you weren't giving in. He also wanted to see what Malfoy was like when he was pissed. So, when midnight arrived on Tuesday, he joined the others in the Slytherin common room. A good-sized crowd had gathered, including most of the Slytherins and Gryffindors, and a good amount of Ravenclaws and Hufflepuffs, too. Some wore warm clothes or had soft-looking blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Luna wore a sequined evening gown, which was too long for her and trailed on the floor at her feet. An old-fashioned turntable with a huge brass horn blasted a scorned warlock song in a cleared-out area in the corner, and a few people gathered around it, moving to the music. Ginny danced with Dean, who was wearing a thick fisherman's jumper. Her hair swung behind her, and Harry was relieved to see her smiling. Someone had conjured a bar. On one side sat a row of mugs and a bubbling cauldron of what Harry guessed was buttered rum. Anthony Goldstein stood behind the other side, looking handsome in green paisley robes that highlighted his dark curly hair and olive skin. He was in the process of mixing a bright red drink with clouds of golden steam puffing from the surface. "That's the Gryffindor," he said, dropping a maraschino cherry into it. "Might burn a bit going down, but it'll give you courage." Warily, Harry took it. It smelled sweet and spicy. He took a sip and winced. It made fire whiskey seem like lemonade. He decided to drink it slowly. "What's in it?" "Red rum, grenadine, ginger beer, and a touch of liquid fire." "What's in the Slytherin?" Harry asked. "Absinthe, Angostura bitters, tonic water, sugar ice, and silver flakes. It's cold, but it'll make you cunning." "You've put a lot of thought into them," said Harry. Anthony beamed. Hermione and Astoria sat talking together near the bookshelves. Harry looked around but didn't see Ron. He sipped his drink and wandered over to the girls. "And did you have a television?" asked Astoria, rapt. "We did," said Hermione. "Moving stories whenever you like? It sounds wonderful. I've always wanted to see one. Do you miss it?" No, not really. Magic is so much more interesting. I feel like I'll never learn it all. You're going to try, though, said Harry, grinning. Hermione returned his smile and nodded at his drink. Careful with that. They're terribly strong, said Astoria. Where's Ron? With a frown, Hermione said, He told me he'd be along later. Harry pushed away a twist of anxiety. Hermione wore a pretty flowered dress, but no scarf or jacket. You don't have a blanket. Astoria casts fantastic warming charms, she said. Would you like one, Harry? Astoria asked. Harry shrugged a yes, and with a shy smile, she twirled her wand. A delicious wave of heat shivered over his skin. Thanks, he said. He hadn't realized how resigned he'd become to feeling cold. The common room looked entirely different now that he was comfortable. The wood carvings and glowing glass of the hanging lamps held a mystical kind of beauty. As he took in the room, however, he realized that with a few exceptions, it was divided into house groups. The Hufflepuffs gathered by the fire, the Slytherins on the chairs and sofas by the windows, the Gryffindors near the dance floor, and Ravenclaws around the drinks. He paused, considering, then went back to the bar. Reckon I'll try a Slytherin, he said to Anthony. You've barely touched your Gryffindor. Planning ahead, said Harry. He carried the drink over to the Slytherins and offered it to Malfoy, who was holding court. Malfoy sat with his legs crossed, arms stretched over the back of the sofa. No robes, but black trousers and a silky-looking reddish shirt with the top 3 buttons undone. It made his hair and skin glow. That for me, Potter? He drawled. Yup, said Harry. Inter-house cooperation. Isn't that what the party's about? You're just trying to get me drunk. That too, said Harry. I want to see what Nott was on about. Malfoy narrowed his eyes, but he took the drink. Daphne sat perched on a chair, dressed in pale blue robes, her hair, a darker blonde than Astoria's, twisted into a knot at the back of her neck. Nott, also in shirt and trousers, both black, leant against the armrest of the sofa, his legs curled beneath him. He, along with Millicent and the other Slytherins, watched eagerly as Malfoy took a sip. I don't remember agreeing to serve as entertainment, said Malfoy. I've a mind not to drink anything at all. That wouldn't do. Don't be ashamed of being a lightweight, said Harry. He took a long slug of his Gryffindor and then had to pause a moment because, holy hell, it was strong and spicy. None of you purebloods can hold your drink. It's just a fact. The Slytherins erupted in outrage, except for Nott, who laughed, covering his mouth with his hand. What you know about purebloods could fit in half a thimble, said Malfoy. Harry shrugged. 4 of my best friends are purebloods. Weasley doesn't... Ow! Malfoy glared at Nott and rubbed his leg where he'd been kicked. Regardless, it's bollocks. Millicent can drink anyone under the table, pureblood or whatever it is you are. He gestured lazily at Harry. Harry, he responded. I'm Harry. You're Potter, said Malfoy, pronouncing the name as if he'd said gutter trash unworthy of my precious pureblood utterance. Harry scowled, irritated at the fact that he found it hot. Who can drink anyone under the table now? Asked Seamus, who'd crept up behind Daphne. Millicent, said Nott. Why? You think you can outdrink her? You're asking me that 'cause I'm Irish, said Seamus. I'll thank you to keep your stereotypes to yourself. On the other foot, I've not yet the man or woman who can hold their spirits better than yours truly. We'll see about that, said Millicent. Little by little, people joined them. Neville and Hannah, Dean and Ginny, Cho, Michael Corner. More chairs were gathered. A Hufflepuff who'd been a year above Harry conjured some big fluffy beanbag seats. Soon almost everyone sat together, laughing and drinking. Music pulsed in the background, a warbling ballad now. Harry slouched in his chair, feeling happy and relaxed. In the back of his mind, he worried about Ron and where he was, but once he'd finished his drink, even that stopped bothering him. Another Gryffindor was placed in his hand. He looked up to see Malfoy, who was holding a sparkly blue cocktail, staring down at him. The view brought back memories. Harry licked his lips. It's a Ravenclaw, said Malfoy, lifting his drink. It's fizzy, but it'll open your mind, according to Goldstein. Malfoy returned to his sofa. Harry was sure he'd unbuttoned another button on his shirt. He said that Hufflepuff was sweet, but it would make you gregarious, said Hannah. The conversation grew louder and more chaotic as the evening progressed. We survived a war, said Ernie Macmillan. You ever think about that? Hard not to when we're all here rebuilding the castle it almost knocked down, said Knot. Knot sounded clearer than Ernie, his diction still clipped. Harry realized that he hadn't had anything to drink. Knot got up and wandered over to the turntable. A moment later, a Boggart song started playing. They were a bit screechy for Harry's taste. Not everyone survived, said Dennis, who was sitting on Susan Bones's lap. She squeezed him and kissed him on the top of his head. What I've always wondered, asked Ernie, is how you did it, Harry. What? Said Harry, going tense. Yeah, Harry, how'd you manage it? Asked Seamus. Convinced him that you were stone dead, old serpent testicles himself? Daphne gasped. Goodness, Finnegan! A dozen curious faces stared at Harry, waiting for him to respond. He glanced at Hermione and saw that she was still deep in conversation with Astoria. He slouched deeper into the chair. I don't really... Have you ever stopped to think about how lucky we are that Potter even survived to Expelliarmus' old noseless noggin? Said Malfoy. How many times did you nearly die of sheer clumsiness before the war even started? Harry blinked at him. Had he changed the subject on purpose because he'd seen Harry squirming? It was the kind of thing Ron would do. Malfoy's cheeks were flushed with drink, his eyes shining. He was probably just drunk. Let's walk it through, Malfoy continued, lying back and crossing his ankles, taking up the space Knot had vacated. His body looked long and lean, all stretched out like that. Malfoy extended a single finger. In first year, your broom tried to kill you. Then you almost choked to death on the snitch. Knot returned and glared at him, but Malfoy only smirked, so Knot plopped down onto one of the beanbags. After snatching it before you could, said Harry to Malfoy. Malfoy raised a second finger. In second year, you face-planted during Quidditch again, and Professor Goldilocks vanished all your bones. Just the bones in my arm, said Harry, not all of them. Malfoy shrugged. We can all agree it's a confirmed fact that you were somewhat boneless. Fine, said Harry, grinning, despite himself. I was a bit boneless in second year. Third year, you fell off your broom yet again. The same year you dressed up as a Dementor to try and put me off? It all comes down to you being jealous that I'm so much better at Quidditch than you are, said Harry. Malfoy wrinkled his nose, which made something fizz inside Harry's chest. Merlin, the drink had really got to him. He took another gulp, barely feeling the burn anymore. You are, of course, entitled to your terrible opinion, Potter, but it's an undisputed fact that I'm a superior player in every way. Ginny, Dean Cho, and some of the others joined Harry in voicing objection to that. Here's my impression of Potter playing Quidditch, said Malfoy. He twitched about a bit on the sofa, then rolled off onto the floor, where he lay moaning dramatically. Harry glanced at Knot, who mouthed, Told you. Here's my impression of you never catching the snitch, said Harry. He plucked the cherry out of his drink and threw it at Malfoy. It hit him on the forehead and fell into his lap. Calmly, Malfoy sat up and held the cherry aloft. It swayed side to side. Potter, he said in an inebriated purr, did you just give me your cherry? Harry cursed himself. And you couldn't even catch that, he said, only managing a whisper. Malfoy raised an eyebrow. He dangled the cherry over his mouth before plucking it off the stem with his teeth. He chewed and swallowed, his long neck undulating. Harry held tight to the armrests of the chair to keep from lunging at him. Heat had spread over the entirety of his body. Merlin, Malfoy, said Neville, looking between him and Harry. A hand came to rest on Harry's shoulder. He smelt flowers, and then Ginny was whispering in his ear. You're drunk. I know, he said, still staring at Malfoy, who wore a luminous, triumphant grin. You're flirting with Malfoy, said Ginny. Avada Kedavra me, said Harry. Well, said Malfoy back on the sofa, is the magic working? I hope we haven't welcomed all this riffraff into our common room for nothing. Being the center of attention made him bright and shiny. Anyone feel a bit warmer than usual? You half-bloods and Muggleborns, give us some feedback. Have we broken the curse of Slytherin yet? I feel lovely and cozy, said Luna, smiling serenely. You're a pureblood, said Hermione, who had joined them at some point. It doesn't count. I just thought it would be nice to share, said Luna. Me? I'm still colder than a witch's tit, said Seamus. He leered at Daphne. Well, some witches' tits. Daphne patted her hair and arched her back. Keep your eyes to yourself, Finnegan. The dungeons are ancient, said Astoria. We can't expect things to change after just one party. We've got to keep at it. Think welcoming thoughts all the time, not just tonight. Welcoming thoughts, said Nott dryly. We should be careful not to overdo it, said Malfoy, rolling up his sleeves. I'm getting a bit overheated. He looked at Harry as he said it. Harry bit his lip, aware that Ginny was watching him. Hannah burst out crying. It took a few seconds, but the conversation tailed off. She stood up, covering her face. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It's a lovely party. I don't want to ruin it. Neville leapt up and put his arms around her. What happened? Asked Astoria, who looked like she might start crying too. Hannah shook her head, but her eyes went to Malfoy and his exposed left forearm. The rest of the room followed her gaze. The mark was faint, just a grayish outline, but still evident. Malfoy stared down at it along with everyone else. All the joy bled out of him. Her mother was murdered by Death Eaters, said Neville. Come on, Han. I'm so sorry, said Hannah again. Don't be sorry, lovely, said Astoria. It's not your fault. Neville ushered Hannah away. The room fell into silence. Malfoy looked sick, like the time he'd overheard Harry and Ron joking about him. Nott spoke. Draco, don't. Malfoy held out a hand, silencing Theo. He got to his feet, swayed, and steadied himself, back straight and chin high. I knew this would be a terrible idea. He glared around at the crowd. None of you belong here. You aren't like us, as if a party was going to change that. Oh, Draco, said Astoria, it wasn't about you. Hannah, Hufflepuffs in the Slytherin common room? What were we thinking? And an abbot at that. They're filthy blood traitors, all of them. Everyone knows. Nott stood. Shut up, Draco. I'll say what I like. This is... He glanced at Harry. Harry turned away. Malfoy took a shuddering breath. The lot of you can fuck right off. He pulled his wand and waved it, making the people in his way shriek as their chairs skidded to the side. He marched through the path he'd made and disappeared into the dorms. Damn it, said Nott. He doesn't mean it, said Astoria. Draco's been through so much. He just had too much to drink and he was upset. He didn't mean any of that. Despite this, people started leaving. It's late anyway, said Cho. Mood's kind of ruined, said Ernie. It was a wonderful party, said Luna. I had a very nice time. You did very well, Astoria, and there will be other chances. She's right, said Hermione. We won't give up. She hesitated, then gave Astoria a hug. Harry stayed in his chair, wrestling with his emotions. He'd forgotten. He'd let himself forget who Malfoy really was. He was a bigoted, self-absorbed git, and Harry was insane for carrying on with him. He had to stop. He had to end it. He already felt embroiled with Malfoy to an uncomfortable extent, but the scene had been a reminder of just who he was dealing with. He got up, waited for his head to stop spinning, then strode toward the dorms. He'd tell Malfoy it was over, that they had to stop. He entered the corridor leading to the dorms and paused. He knew that sound. He'd heard it before, during 6th year, and it had led to him coming very close to killing Malfoy. Thanking Meyer for teaching him how to silence his footsteps, he crept toward the room Malfoy shared with Nott and put his ear to the door. Malfoy was crying, thick, strangled sobs, as if he were trying hard to hold them in. Shocked, Harry remained still, listening. Malfoy had looked so cold as he'd left the room. He pressed his palm against the door, wondering what to do. The sounds Malfoy was making pained him. He wanted to make Malfoy stop. No, he wanted to help Malfoy stop. For a moment he considered going in and put his hand on the knob. Then he realized it was a terrible idea. The last time he'd confronted Malfoy when he'd been crying alone, it had not gone well. Malfoy wouldn't want Harry to see him like that. Vulnerable. Human, Harry thought with some bitterness. And if he was being honest, Harry found the idea of trying to comfort a crying Malfoy terrifying. He knew he'd bollocks it up. He walked back to the common room with his hands in his pockets and whispered in Astoria's ear. Her face creased in concern. She nodded, then got up and went after Malfoy. Harry was very tempted to snatch up his invisibility cloak and listen at the door, but decided it probably wouldn't be the right thing to do. He trudged into his own dorm. Ron's bed was empty. He'd never joined the party. Harry plopped face down onto his bed and lay still, absently watching Seamus and Daphne make out across the room. Seamus had his fingers in her hair. Daphne seemed to be trying to claw off his shirt. After a moment, Seamus broke off and noticed him. "All right there, Harry? How you keepin'?" "Confused," said Harry. He spelled his bed curtains shut to give them privacy and stared up at the canopy. "I'm pretty fucking confused." The sun hung thick and golden in the sky, painting the Hogwarts grounds with honey-colored late afternoon light. The trees on the outskirts of the forest stood still, their leaves barely stirring. Harry thrummed with excitement. This wasn't just an exercise. This was real. They were going after Dolohov. He'd slept off the worst of his hangover, although his mind still crackled around the edges. When he'd finally got out of bed and gone to lunch, Ron was there, spooning peas onto his plate. He laughed at something Theo said and dug into his chicken pie, looking happier than Harry had seen him in a year. Harry exchanged a look with Hermione. While it was wonderful to see Ron cheerful, he couldn't help but worry about the reasons for it, especially when Ginny tried to speak to her brother and he ignored her. Now, as they waited in the formation in which the Aurors had arranged them, Ron stood tense and determined, rolling his wand between his fingers. "We're going to do it, Harry," he said. "We're going to get him. Dolohov will rot in Azkaban like the rest of them. I can't wait to tell Fred and Lupin, and Mum. He killed her brothers, you know, Gideon and Fabian." Harry nodded, trying not to show his unease. "We're going to get him." Ron stood at Harry's right, Theo on his left, Lavender and Parvati in front. The girls had learned about the mission. They seemed to always know everything that was going on in the castle, and insisted they be allowed to come along. Meyer and Jimenez led the way, while 4 other Aurors covered the flanks and rear of the group. "Right," said Jimenez. "Consider yourself honorary junior Aurors for the day, which means you're all subject to the chain of command. Should a senior Auror give you an order, you will obey it immediately and without question. Is that clear?" Harry, along with the others, answered in the affirmative. Meyer winked at him. Harry gave him a nod. If he could manage to get Dolohov himself, he could prove to Meyer that he was capable, that he wasn't just a kid. On the other hand, he didn't want to let Meyer down again by disobeying orders. They started at the spot in which they'd found Dolohov's camp. It was now deserted, of course. The campfire hadn't been lit in a while. After stealth and tracking spells had been cast, the senior Aurors cast silent hominum revelio charms as they circled outwards, little by little, moving deeper and deeper into the forest. It seemed an unwieldy way to go about it. Pairing off would have made more sense and allowed them to cover more ground in less time, but this was safest. The further they moved, the thicker the trees grew. It became difficult to stay in formation. The canopy above blocked more of the sun, making it darker and colder. The larger group put distance between Harry and Meyer. He missed the connection they had when it was just the 2 of them. An hour passed and they'd found nothing. They reached an upward slope and began to climb. Halfway up, the earth gave out beneath Nott's feet, and he fell to his knees. Parvati helped him up again. Nott nodded his thanks. It felt like something interesting had happened. Harry struggled to stay focused. Nott was skinny and not very athletic looking. Harry didn't know if he'd make a good Auror. Of course, different kinds of skills were necessary. Maybe Nott would be brilliant at strategy or counter curses. Harry liked him. He had a way of fading into the woodwork, but when he did speak up, he generally had something interesting to say. Funny how he'd gone through school without getting to know any of the Slytherins. The louder ones, Malfoy and Parkinson, had overshadowed the rest of the group. Malfoy had been such a nasty piece of work. Really, he'd been horrible. He'd called Hermione a mudblood, bullied Ron about his family. He'd given Harry shit about the fact that his parents were dead. It was hard to meld that with the boy sobbing in his bedroom, like a maths problem for which you just couldn't find a satisfying solution. Malfoy hadn't appeared at breakfast or lunch that day, and Harry hadn't seen him in the common room. He was probably still upset about what had happened at the party. Every single person in the room had been staring at his mark. Harry imagined that would feel scary and humiliating. Malfoy wasn't a Death Eater anymore. Harry really believed that. When faced with the reality of what following Voldemort meant, he'd been sickened. But the consequences of his choice would be permanently etched on his skin for the rest of his life. Harry rubbed his fingers over his scar. He knew what it was like to have a visible sign of your past on display. He knew what it was like to be judged for it. "Halt!" cried Jimenez. The oars stopped short, and Harry walked into Lavender, making her squeak. Sorry, he whispered. "Defensive positions," said Jimenez. The oars turned outwards, wands drawn. Harry snuck a glance at Meyer, who was coiled with magical energy, then adjusted his stance to imitate him. Branches crackled and heavy footsteps sounded. 3 centaurs emerged from the woods, bows aimed at them. Lavender and Parvati gasped. Harry recognized the dark skin and wild beard of the largest of them. "What brings men into our forest?" Bane towered over them, as fierce and hostile as ever. "We have ministry permission," said Jimenez, holding her wand steady. "Your human ministry has no say here. This is our territory, and we make our own laws. You are trespassing." "Back off, Bane," said Harry. "We're after an escaped Death Eater. He's as much a threat to you and your herd as he is to us." Jimenez shot Harry a death glare. Harry ignored both her and Meyer's urgent whispers. Bane held his bow steady. "You remember the Death Eaters, don't you?" said Harry. "They aren't fond of non-human beings. You fought against them in the end." "We will find the Death Eater and deal with him ourselves if he's been foolish enough to encroach upon our land. As human beings, we assert our right to hunt and punish our own criminals," said Jimenez. Bane considered her. He snorted and shifted on his feet. The other 2 centaurs flipped their tails. One was pure white with vines braided into her mane, the other chestnut. Harry didn't recognize either of them. Bane lowered his bow. "See you conduct your business with speed. Your war caused great damage to the forest. Do not extend it." "We'll do our best," said Jimenez. Bane gave her a solemn nod. "How's Firenze?" asked Lavender, whose eyes had gone wide and dreamy. Ignoring her question, Bane turned and galloped off between the trees, followed by the 2 other centaurs. "Let me do the talking in the future," said Jimenez to Harry. "Fine." Harry crossed his arms. "He's just very annoying." "He's gorgeous," said Parvati. "So majestic." Jimenez rubbed her eyes. "It's starting to get dark. Dolohov must have moved deeper into the forest. Let's get the kids back to the castle. We'll have to call in another team or 2. Harry bristled but stayed silent. "A good exercise, even if we did not find anything useful, yes?" said Meyer to Harry. "Sure," said Harry, "but I want to—" Everything went black. Lavender gave a little shriek, and Jimenez said, "Shh! Stay still! No one move!" "Lumos," came Meyer's voice. Some of the others followed suit. "Lumos." Harry slit his eyes open, but darkness remained complete. "It's darkness powder," said Ron. "Someone threw darkness powder." "Damn it," said Jimenez. "Orders, surround the kids! Face out! Protego!" Someone yelled, and there was the thump of a falling body. The Auror started shouting, "Stupefy! Protego! Stupefy!" Wand out, Harry twisted one way, then the other, trying to figure out where the curses were coming from. "Get down!" That was Meyer's voice, Harry was sure. Ah! Another thump. "No!" Harry lurched towards the spot where Meyer had stood, but smacked into someone's shoulder and rebounded backwards. He tripped over what felt like a body and crashed to the ground. "Meyer!" The heat of a curse shot over his shoulder. "Be quiet, Potter," said Jimenez. Harry felt along the body until he felt long hair. Not Meyer, one of the female Aurors. He pushed the hair off her neck and felt for a pulse. At first he found nothing, and hysteria tightened inside him. He moved his hand tighter behind her ear, and there it was. A tap, tap, tap against his fingertip. He shuddered with relief. "Harry!" a rough whisper. "Ron," he said. He scrambled backwards through the dirt and leapt to his feet. "Where are you?" "I'm here. I'm right here," said Ron. Harry reached out. Spellfire crackled through the air and he ducked. "Move," said Jimenez. "We've got to get out of the range of the powder. Grab hands with the people nearest and move backwards." Harry felt through the air until he found a bony wrist. A wall of heat exploded in front of him and he stumbled. Holding tight to the wrist with one hand, he flung the other in front of his face and tried to move away from the heat, crashing through the trees he couldn't see. Rough bark scraped against his arms. A low-hanging branch smacked into his forehead. His heart pounded, and adrenaline shot cold through his limbs as he prayed that no one had been killed. "Ron, are you all right?" "It's not Ron, it's me," said Knot. Harry spun around and tried to go back. "Don't be a fucking idiot," said Knot. Heavy footsteps sounded nearby. "Run!" A hand slapped at Harry's face and then covered his mouth. He clawed it off, but Knot was pulling him away, saying, "We've got to get out of the dark. We can't do anything until we can see. They're back there in the fire. We've got to help them." "Merlin, you're as bad as they say. If we got out, they probably did too." Harry released his wrist and lunged towards the heat, but Knot grabbed a handful of his shirt. They struggled, Harry trying to return to the fire, Knot pulling him away from it. Harry stepped back, and there was nothing there. He lost his balance and plummeted down the hill they'd climbed, scraping through the dirt. Knot cried out and fell with him. As they settled at the bottom of the hill, Harry realized he could see again. They were out of the range of the darkness. Knot gaped at him, breathing hard, his eyes wide, his face streaked with dirt. Harry rolled away and got to his feet. His arm bled where he'd scraped it, and his side throbbed in a way that said it would hurt a lot more in a few hours. Knot pushed himself up onto his knees and went rigid. "I'm going back," said Harry. "You aren't going anywhere, child," said a low voice. Harry spun around and saw what had made Knot freeze. Dolohov stood halfway down the hill, his face twisted in a vicious leer. "Harry Potter, just the man I wanted to see." Harry surged with anger and frustration. Why did it always have to be him? "I was hoping to see you too," he said. "So are the Aurors. There's a cell in Azkaban with your name on it." Dolohov laughed. "Doesn't look very likely they'll catch me at the moment, does it? They're all burnt to a crisp." "You're lying!" Harry shouted. Theo stood up, his wand outstretched, attention entirely focused on Dolohov. "No one caught fire," he said. "We'd have heard them screaming if they had." "Little Knot," said Dolohov, "and you'd know, wouldn't you? Remember that bird in Devon? She screamed like a banshee. Couldn't shut her up. Had to give her the old AK so as not to alert the neighbors." "I remember," said Knot, his voice steady. "Then back away, child. Potter's all I want." "You think doing me in will bring your Dark Lord back?" asked Harry. "Because it won't. He's gone for good this time." "I haven't shed any tears for that fool. Let him rot. I'm not after bringing him back. I'm after what you have." "I haven't caught anything!" Harry's voice shook. "I'm just a kid." He needed to know if Ron, Meyer, and the others were safe. If the girls were safe. If anyone had been killed. "You're a sight more than that, and you know it," said Dolohov. His meaning hit Harry like a blow between the eyes. "No," he said. His shoulders heaved, and he shook his head. "The wand!" Dolohov was talking about mastery of the Elder Wand. Harry'd thought he'd put it all behind him, but no, even now, after everything, he was still marked, still an unwilling target. "I won't let you do it." Again, Dolohov laughed. "You won't have a say in the matter." He pointed his wand. Harry braced himself, defensive spells spiraling through his head. "Incendio," said Dolohov, relish in his voice. "Protego," said Harry, diving to the side. "Glacius!" screamed Knot. The bolt of flame shooting from Dolohov's wand turned blue, froze, then fell to the ground, where it crumbled into nothing. "You were paying attention, weren't you?" Dolohov said to Knot. "Clever boy. Your father would be so proud." "You're getting weak, Dolohov," said Knot. "Your incendio is a far cry from what I remember." My spells are as powerful as ever. Incendio! Another blast of flame shot towards Harry. Harry joined Nott in repelling it with Glacius. He wasn't sure why Nott seemed to be egging Dolohov on. See, said Nott. Pathetic. A 5-year-old could counter that. Dolohov's face twisted with fury. I'll show you, you brat. Incendio! Fire spilled from his wand in a tsunami blaze. Harry staggered back from the force of it, crying, Glacius! Along with Nott. They barely managed to repel it. Sweat poured down Nott's face and neck. Enough of this, said Dolohov. He focused on Harry. Harry saw in his eyes what he was going to do, and he knew he couldn't counter it. He leapt to the side to get further away from Nott, and knowing speed was his only chance, he said, Expelli Avada Kedavra. A voice from the top of the hill interrupted him. Stupefy! Dolohov ducked, leaving his curse unfinished. Jimenez cast again. Stupefy! Dolohov blocked it. They each cast again, making the trees around them explode into splinters as they dueled. Harry raised his wand to join in, but Nott said, For the love of Merlin, Potter! Grabbed Harry's arm and pulled him away. Stunned by what Dolohov had revealed, Harry didn't resist. They crashed through the trees into a small clearing a few yards away. A trickle of blood ran down Harry's forearm and dripped onto the forest floor. He shivered with adrenaline. Dolohov and others like him would be after Harry forever, for the rest of his life. Anyone who'd heard what he'd said before he disarmed Voldemort would know that Harry was the master of the Elder Wand. Dolohov wouldn't be the last. He thrust his fingers into his hair. You all right, Potter? Asked Nott. He leant against a tree trunk, staring down at his leg. Sure, said Harry. I'm perfect. Shouts blending with the snap and crackle of spellfire sounded in the near distance. More of the Aurors had joined Jimenez. They'd keep Dolohov busy. Let's get back to the spot where he originally attacked and see if anyone needs help. He ached to see Ron, to know he wasn't hurt or worse. Yes, okay, said Nott. They circled around the bottom of the hill and began to climb. The shouting grew louder, but the fighting seemed to have stopped. They've caught him, Harry said. I'll bet they've caught him. Maybe. Nott didn't look convinced. Harry grabbed a branch to lever himself upwards. Nott didn't follow. Hey, Harry said, are you coming or not? Nott hugged himself, his face pinched and white. I did something to my knee when we fell. I don't think I can climb the hill. Potter! Nott! Wait where you are. We're coming for you. That was Jimenez. They waited, listening to the Aurors approach. Although Harry's sense of direction was messed up because it sounded as if they were coming from the wrong direction. No, that was someone else. Something else. Something much bigger than a person. Harry raised his wand, searching the forest around them. Nott did the same. Harry smelt rotting meat. A thicket of saplings snapped and fell beneath thick, hairy legs as an acromantula forced its way into the clearing. What is that? Nott screamed, staggering away from it. What is that thing? The spider ignored Nott and went straight for Harry. Harry shot a bombard at it, making it squeal and skid backwards, but it kept coming for him. He grabbed a branch, hauled himself up into a tree, and climbed. The spider reached the trunk. Harry scrambled higher, his arms aching, hoping the spider would be too unwieldy to follow. When he'd climbed as high as he could go, he looked down. The spider had gone up on its hind legs. It reached for him, pincers clacking, but Harry was too high up. Back away, Harry said. I'll have Hagrid after you. You know he hates it when you try to eat us. You're talking to it? Nott's voice had gone high and wobbly. Jimenez arrived in the clearing, breathing hard. 2 of the other Aurors were with her, and Ron, along with Lavender and Parvati. Harry shuddered with relief. They began shooting spells at the spider, which squealed again and curled into a ball, its giant legs folded. Did you get him? Harry called from his tree. Did you get Dolohov? He got away, said Jimenez, disillusioned himself and ran off. Harry cursed, a wild, desperate feeling swelling in his chest. All that, and they accomplished nothing. Is Meyer all right? He held his breath. He was wounded, said Jimenez. Russell and Jape have taken him to St. Mungo's. You all right, Ron? Asked Harry. He started climbing down the tree. But Ron was fixated on the spider, his eyes wide. his face green. The spider twitched. Then, with surprising speed, it righted itself and scrambled to the center of the clearing. Ron shrieked. Lavender and Parvati flew into each other's arms. The oars shot spells at it again. It was too late. Knot, directly in its path, screamed and tried to run, but his knee collapsed and the acromantula was on him. Before anyone could stop it, the spider gathered him up in its hairy legs and carried him off into the forest.